Christian Bible, the first 3/4 of it is all the Hebrew Bible. So in this Bible, for instance, all of this is the Hebrew Scriptures. And all of this is the Christian Scriptures. So it's a lot smaller. And the Christian Scriptures consist of 4 Gospels. The Gospels are the life of Jesus. Gospel is actually a word that means good news. And it was Goda spell in Middle English, like about 1,000 years ago. It was good news, and spell meant news. But it got squeezed into gospel. And so there's a gospel or a good news according to 4 different people in the Christian Bible. And the reason it's called good news is because Jesus came with this message of forgiveness. God will heal the poor, feed the hungry, and get kind of the world back on the right foot. So I am come to, actually, you probably read that in Luke, if you did your reading in Luke. So he says, toward the beginning of his ministry, he said, he's quoting actually from Isaiah. Isaiah is one of the major Hebrew prophets. And he says, he goes to the front of the synagogue, and he's male, so he gets to read from the text if they call upon him to do that. So they say, okay, he's in Galilee. He's in Nazareth, actually, his hometown. So they say, okay, Jesus, you can come up and read the scroll today. They may not realize that he's just been out in the desert for 40 days. He's just been anointed or baptized by John the Baptist, and he has this new sense of his mission. So he gets up to read the scripture, and the scripture he chooses is Isaiah, and he reads one that says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolls up the scroll, he gives it back, and he sits down, and they're all looking at him like, whoa, you really read that. You read that with a sense of authority. And, but they also said, wait a minute, this is just Joseph's son. You know, why is he reading this like upon me? He's not just reading. So that was the beginning of his ministry. Anyway, so it's called the good news because he came to say, you know, repent, start over, let's get things right, and I care about the poor, the oppressed, the prisoners, so the blind, handicapped. So it's called good news. Okay, the 4 versions of Jesus' life, one by Matthew, one by Mark, one by Luke, one by John. The one by Luke, which I asked you to read, is actually part 1 of a book that includes the story of Jesus' life, the Gospel of Luke, and part 2, the Acts of the Apostles, what all of his followers did in the next 5 or 8 years or so, maybe even 10 years after Jesus died. So really, it's by the same person, part 1, part 2, Luke, Acts. After you get the 4 Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, then you've got a whole lot of letters, mostly letters written by Paul, who first was pretty upset with these crazy people following Jesus, but then he converted, he became a big leader, and he started founding churches, traveling all over the Mediterranean, and then writing letters to each church that he founded. So, and then there's a few other things that are not letters. There are letters by a few other people, and there are also the book of Revelation, which is not a letter, but it's a vision, and it's drawing a lot on the book of Ezekiel and on Hebrew prophets. It's a really complicated book. Actually, there's a lecture tonight on the book of Revelations, the Getty Museum, by a famous scholar, Elaine Pagels, and I'm hoping to get to that lecture tonight. So that's what the New Testament is. The 4 Gospels, the Acts, a bunch of letters, and Revelation. Okay? Now let's look at each of the Gospels. So, the Gospel of Matthew And actually, Matthew probably didn't actually write this. The only gospel that actually says, I wrote this, is the Gospel of Luke, where the author says in the beginning, he says, "O Theophilus, I decided there were all kinds of things being circulated, different quotes of Jesus and stories of Jesus." So he says at the very first line of his book, he says, "Men have undertaken to set down an orderly account of all this stuff that's happened among us." So he says, "I too decided, investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account." So he's like an amateur historian. He wants to get it right, to get all the different other things that have been written, collect them, put them together. You don't get that kind of a statement at the beginning of Matthew, Mark, or John. So, if you look at your timelines, you find that the earliest one written is Mark. So Mark is the gospel that is the one that is, sections of it are used by Luke and by Matthew, and a little bit by John, but not really. John is primarily just another completely different account of events in the life of Jesus. So Mark is the earliest, and its date might be as early as the year 60. So that should be on your, 65, okay. So let's put down 65. So that's about 30 years after the death of Jesus. So actually, when it says Jesus was born in the 3rd year of the reign of Caesar Augustus, that puts a timeline for us, and probably his birth was actually 3 years before what they started marking as the year 0. So we'll put him born -3 and him dying about the year 30. And Mark is being written about 30, 35 years later. So Mark clearly took different quotations and examples that people had been writing down and telling each other, and he wrote it all down. And Mark starts out with a bang. It's a very energetic gospel. It's all about, he did this and they got mad at him, he did this, and it just kind of sets the plot going for, and he's going to be crucified, and then he comes back. So it's an action-packed version of the life of Jesus. He doesn't care about the birth. He doesn't give us anything about that. But Matthew is putting together an account. He's looking at Mark, or some version of Mark, and he's writing for a community in Antioch of Syria. So there's a big community of Christians up there in Syria, in a huge community called Antioch. There's another Antioch further north of Turkey, but anyway, in this Antioch there's a big community of Christians, and Matthew, and these are all Jewish Christians. They're people who have been scattered by the diaspora, right? That's where we left off with our study of women in Judaism. So these people have been scattered. There's a huge community not too far north of Israel in Syria. He's writing for those people. His is the most Jewish-oriented. He's really writing everything that happens in the life of Jesus. He goes through the Torah, and he finds a prediction or something that describes what was going to happen in the life of Jesus. He says, see, Jesus did this, but it said the Messiah would do this. He's basically writing to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. He's really interested. He's writing for Jewish Christians, and he's very interested in Jesus being the Messiah. He has all these quotes from the Torah in his version. Mark is not interested in that. Mark he's actually mentioned in the book of Acts. He's a younger disciple, and he would never have known Jesus. He's probably 40 or 30 when he's writing. Luke is this person who is trying to organize the papers and write a really authoritative history. And he's doing both this gospel of Jesus' life and the book of Acts. He's probably written around the year 70, or possibly as late as the year 80 of the Common Era. So he also is looking at Mark. Luke is interesting, and actually his name never occurs in it. So we don't really know who wrote it. We know that somebody sat down and tried to be a really good historian. But the reason people think it is Luke is because the character Luke pops up in the book of Acts. And the book of Acts, about 10 or 12 chapters into it, starts saying, and I noticed this, and we did that, and we did this. And that's the same time that Paul is traveling, and he meets a person named Luke, who is a doctor and who travels with him. So the idea that Luke wrote Luke and Acts is a theory, it's a hypothesis. The other interesting thing about the book of Luke, the gospel, is it's got all these medical comments in it. It's full of this healing and that healing, and the woman with the issue of blood, you know, exactly how many years she had had it and how many doctors she had been to. And so that's why they say, oh, Luke, the beloved physician is what he's called. He's got kind of a medical interest there. Yes?
There's no date for Matthew.
Matthew's in between Mark and Luke. The latest one is John. So I put John on your timeline because he's kind of the most far out in time as well as in content. So he's maybe 80 to 90 of the Common Era.
John is 80 to 90.
The Gospel according to John. Matthew, he's not the earliest, he's not the latest. So you can stick him in on that timeline wherever you want. You don't have to know when he was written because we don't exactly know. But the main thing is he's writing for a community of Jewish Christians, and he's really interested in the whole Messiah thing, and he's quoting all this stuff from the Torah. Okay. So Luke in his gospel and Matthew, they start out with a chronology. So you get in the first chapter of Luke, actually Luke doesn't do it to the extent that Matthew does, but if you turn to the first chapter of Matthew, you get account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David. And it starts out with Abraham was the father of Isaac, was the father of Jacob, and it goes on and on. Interesting, the woman Tamar is mentioned. Do you remember who she was? A lot of you included her in
the harlot?
Daughter of David?
Yeah, the sister of
Yeah.
which one of David's sons rapes her?
Abimelech.
Yeah, daughter of David who is raped. She's in the family tree for Jesus. Rahab is in the tree, the prostitute spy who lets them into Jericho. Ruth is mentioned, so that interesting that in this mostly male genealogy, some key women are put in. It's also interesting that the genealogy ends up with Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. So if all this is Joseph's genealogy, why aren't we getting Mary's genealogy? Well, that's a question I can't answer. Anyway, Matthew's interested in genealogy. Luke is to some extent. Mark doesn't even include the childhood. Mark starts right out with in the beginning of the good news of Jesus, Jesus was out, John the Baptist was out in the wilderness baptizing people, telling them, repent, someone else is coming along who's stronger than I. And then Jesus comes up and gets baptized, and boom, all these things start happening. He collects disciples, he starts running into trouble with the authorities. So that's the action-oriented gospel, that's the Jewish history-oriented gospel. This is the one that has the most about women and the most about medical things. That's why we're reading Luke, is because it has more encounters of Jesus with women than any of the other Gospels. Also because it's part one of Luke and Acts. John is an interesting Gospel. Instead of starting out with a genealogy, John starts out in the beginning. And instead of saying in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, John says, in the beginning was the Word. The actual Greek word is logos. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through Him. Without Him, not one thing came into being. So he's launching into theology. He's like, I don't care about His birth. I'm just going to tell you the important things about Jesus, which is He's with God, part of God, is God. So does that remind you about anything we talked about in the last part of this class about Judaism and someone else who was in there in the beginning with God during creation? Wisdom. Very good. Sophia,
yeah,
right.
Sophia was
Right.
like the feminine part
So,
and the gender. Yeah.
many scholars have looked at this passage in the beginning of John and said, pretty interesting that his whole description of this logos, and I'll put that word on the board, that's the Greek word that means word, this word force being in the beginning with God, that sure sounds a lot like Chokhmah or Sophia or Lady Wisdom. And so what they're figuring is that in the 10 or 20 years after Jesus died, and according to Christian tradition was resurrected, people were trying to figure out who He was. Why did He come back after He died? Why are all these miracles recorded? Who is He? Is He the Messiah? What is He? So they ended up deciding He was God come to earth in human form to give humans a message, to reconcile humans with their Creator. So like God is holy, humans are not. There's a gap to try to bridge that gap and bring them together. So that was what they concluded. So, but when they were thinking about that, they really looked at Chokhmah in the Old Testament and that line about her being in the beginning with God, part of creation. So basically, a lot of scholars believe that the understanding of Jesus was, it was understood that Chokhmah and Jesus were same, very similar. The understanding of Jesus was shaped by the understanding of Chokhmah. But they weren't going to put a female figure and say, in the beginning was Chokhmah, this strongly female figure, and she was with God, and Jesus was her. No, they weren't going to go anywhere near that. They changed it to logos, which is a masculine Greek word. So anyway, that's a whole interesting feminist theological biblical study in itself, which I've heard lectures about. Anyway, so John is all about theology, and one of the very first stories that he tells, besides Jesus being baptized, is about, he does do the wedding where Jesus changes water to wine. But an interesting one is where he encounters a woman at a well, and he gets in a theological conversation with a woman in just chapter 4 of the book of John. And he shouldn't be talking to her because she's from Samaria, not the core of Judaism in Israel and Judah. But he gets into a conversation with her, and she says, she actually said, he says, go call your husband and come back. She says, I don't have a husband. He says, yeah, actually, you've had 5 husbands and you're on your 6th. But you're not married to him yet. And she goes, oh my God, he knows about me. And so she runs and gets people. But first she's in a conversation with him, and she says, you know what? I know all about Judaism. I worship God, YHWH, the Holy One, whose name can't be spoken. She says, God is a spirit. And she says, I know the Messiah is coming. I know all about that. And Jesus says, I am He, to her. So he didn't say this to anybody else. Even when his disciples asked him, you know, are you the Messiah? Are you John the Baptist come back to life? Are you Elijah come back? He said, you know, let's not talk about this. I don't want to get into trouble. Don't tell anybody what you know. But with her, he's saying, yeah, you know about the Messiah, and I'm the Messiah. So anyway, John gets into theology very early. Let's just say that. The other interesting bang at the end of the Gospel of John is when the women come to the tomb. Mary Magdalene has a big encounter with Jesus at the tomb, which has got more details than in Luke, which you read, and also more than in Matthew and Mark. So, those are the Gospels in a nutshell. Let me pass around a copy of the Hebrew, of the Greek New Testament. So this whole Bible is written in Greek. So I want you to look at it and see what Greek looks like. This also has no punctuation, no chapter headings, no capital letters. So people who translated it or who copied it later said, okay, I think a period belongs here. I think we'll have a new chapter starting here, and we'll count each sentence. We'll number it, verse 1, verse 2. But the original text didn't have that. You couldn't even tell where words ended, except that you knew where the word would end. Like if you saw a sentence without spaces between the words, you would pretty much know where the words were. So, let's see. And here's another one I'll pass on the other side of the room. This is a Bible which conveniently has the Greek in the middle and the English underneath each line. So if you want to know what the really Greek original was for any chapter, you can turn to that chapter and find the English under the line. And so you can turn to actually the book of John, chapter 1, and you can see where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So I'll just put a little bookmark in there. And actually, this is a reminder that each one is the gospel according to. So kata is the word for according to in Greek. And it doesn't really say Matthew wrote it. It's according to. So it could be handed down from the famous disciple Matthew and written down in honor of Matthew. So it's not necessarily Matthew's actual words. So the gospel according to. So I'll just pass these around so you can take a look and realize that once again we have the problem of translation. How are we going to cope with a text where the words are not familiar with us and they've been translated into English and to other languages, but not always in the best way. For instance, there are many times in the book of Acts where it mentions the brothers did this, the brothers did that. And that's the Christian believers. They're referred to as brothers. Were there women present? Yeah, there's mention of women in a lot of lines, but it never says brothers and sisters. But modern translations put in brother and sisters because it's kind of like the Spanish word padres for parents. So if you say mis padres, it means my parents. It doesn't mean my two fathers. But so this Greek word that means brothers, they're now translating it brothers and sisters. But that's just one of the little issues that comes up in translation. Okay, let's turn now just to the Gospel of Luke. And let's talk about some of the encounters of Jesus with women in the Gospel of Luke. So I'm going to ask you to point out to me which ones caught your attention. And actually, I put up on your Moodle site, I put a list of every time Jesus talks to or mentions or encounters a woman. But I would like you to tell me which ones caught your attention. So, it's actually study guide number 11, Jesus interacting with women in the Gospel of Luke. So, someone share with me, which one caught your attention?
Chapter 21, verse 1 and 4. And he raises the poor widow above wealthy men.
Aha! She's going right to Jesus raising the status of a poor widow above the wealthy men who are contributing. So that's chapter 20?
24. Did you say 21?
Chapter 21, verse, well, here it says verse 1.
Okay. So, he saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He saw also a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, she has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all she had. And that probably did not make any of the rich people there very happy that day. We'll have to look also at a design of what the temple area looked like. So, but roughly, if this is the temple, this is the part that anybody can come in. This is the part that women can come in. Actually, it's more like this. And this is the part that the Jewish men can come in. So she had to be just right about there, and he had to be walking in like this and seeing her, putting her, and so this is the Holy of Holies. So the part that only the priest could go into, and then only one day a year, there's even a more special part there. So there she is doing her thing in the part that she's allowed to be in, and he's saying, she's cool. She's probably better than the guy next to her who's putting in a lot. Good one. So the poor widow is noticed. Anyone else have one that caught your attention where Jesus is interacting with a woman? Yes?
Yes, well, I don't remember, they didn't really interact with the one that touched the hem of, like, the fabric.
Yeah, that's one of the most dramatic ones, the touching the hem. And who is it who touched the hem of his garment?
It's just a woman with, like, the flowing with blood for, like, 12 years.
Bleeding, yeah.
That reminded me of, like, the purity laws and, like, the nail and all that stuff.
Excellent, yes.
It's in Luke chapter 8.
Chapter 8, thank
Yeah,
you.
like verse 40.
Chapter 8 is really a dynamite chapter in the book of Luke. So much is happening in it. So, beginning of chapter 8, yeah, there's a lot happening in it. But anyway, there's a crowd around him. He's going to heal somebody else who's called him, and he's interrupted. How do we react when interrupted? There's a story about this Samaritan who was laying by the side of the road, and the busy people pass by, and the one who's kind actually stops. But here, he's not planning to do any miracles or anything. But there's a woman who has this guess, this hypothesis. She says, I bet if I could just touch. Probably she's actually trying to touch his prayer shawl, or the prayer corner, the tzitzil, dangling from the prayer shawl. If I could just touch that, I bet I could get healed. So she's willing to give it a try. She comes up behind him, touches it, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Now, how can you know that? I don't know how you know that suddenly you're no longer bleeding. But she feels something dramatic, some zap of some kind. And Jesus says, who touched me? His disciples' reaction? What do you mean, who touched you? There's an entire crowd here jostling through the streets. And he says, someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out of me. When she saw she couldn't remain hidden, she did not want to get found out. And as you mentioned, the Nidal laws have a part here. So what would be the consequences if she touched a man or a holy man, especially if he were on his way to the temple, synagogue? And if she were bleeding, if she were in her period, which unfortunately was lasting 12 years, yeah, she could be in big trouble. Well, she might not be stoned, but she at least would have made him unclean. So he couldn't go preach or do whatever he was going to do in the temple if he was heading that direction. He's actually heading to heal somebody, but not a good idea to go up and touch a stranger if you're a female bleeding and he's a man. Not a good idea. So she's like, uh-oh, I'm found out. They're going to get me now. And she comes up to him trembling. She falls down before him. Good idea, right? She declares why she touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he says to her, get out of here and don't ever do this again? No. He says, daughter, wow, he called her a daughter? Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And then they say, oh, don't bother to do that healing you were on the way to because the kid already died. And then he has to deal with that. So boom, we're on into another story in the 8th chapter of Luke. But very nice one, thank you. Okay, another one that caught your attention. Brandon.
Mine was Luke chapter 7, verse 37 to 43, I believe. 44.
Okay, and which story is that?
And it was when Jesus was having dinner with the Pharisees, and a woman who was a sinner came and she was crying, and she bathed Jesus' feet. He washed his feet with her tears and then anointed him with oil. And the Pharisees were like, "Don't you see she's a sinner? Like, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
And then you see the parable of the two debtors saying, you know, he who loves more forgives more,
Great.
and he who forgives less does not love less. And
Right.
so he's like, sure, she's a sinner, but you know, she's forsaking her sins, and he blesses her and says that her faith has made her whole.
Exactly. His disciples have a hard time with him. He's always doing things that's not cool to do for a man in his day. So he's at a nice dinner at a nice house, and the host they're all sitting there nicely, and this woman comes up and she starts crying and washing his feet with her tears. That's a lot of tears. And with her hair. And they're like, Jesus, you know, don't talk to her. I mean, get her out of here. Just tell her you're healed and she'll leave or something. But he says, you know what? Like the widow story, he says, her sins have been forgiven and she's showing so much love. And the guy whose house I'm at didn't even bother to send someone to wash my feet for this nice dinner that we're at. So he's again contrasting two people in their devotion. I want you to notice before we leave today that that woman is nameless. She doesn't have a name in that story. Actually, she's called a sinner. Well, what kind of sin do you think she did? Was she a robber? Was she too proud? Was she a liar? Probably a sexual sin, right? Otherwise, that she wouldn't be called a sinner. But important to notice, she has no name. About 5 lines later in chapter 8, we hear about some women who were traveling around with Jesus. Mary called Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna. Mary called Magdalene is not the woman from the previous chapter who's the sinner who washes his feet. But simply because her name pops up 10 lines later, she gets that reputation. Somehow, as the legends go, she gets called a sinner and a prostitute. And she's not. All it says about her is, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. So that's some kind of healing from mental illness, epilepsy, something like that. We don't know exactly what that is in our terms. But she's not a sexual sinner. It's the other lady who's might even not be a sexual sinner. But so this is one of the misconceptions that's floating around in regard to Jesus and women. So, okay, we'll continue.